General Erich Marcks stood on the cliffs of Normandy at 0630 hours on June 6, 1944, watching an armada so vast it defied comprehension. 7,000 Allied vessels stretching across the English Channel like a steel carpet laid upon the sea. In that moment, the 3-year-old Wehrmacht commander realized with absolute clarity that Germany had already lost the war. What he couldn't have known was that his own intelligence reports, sitting unread in a safe just 12 kilometers away, had predicted this exact scenario 3 months earlier and been dismissed as alarmist fantasy by his superiors in Berlin. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how German commanders came to face the largest amphibious invasion in human history begins not on the beaches of Normandy, but in a dimly lit bunker beneath the streets of Paris, 14 months before D-Day. It was April 1943, and Generalmajor Erich Marcks, Chief of Staff for the German military command in northern France, sat hunched over a wooden desk covered in reconnaissance photographs and intelligence summaries. A veteran of the Eastern Front who'd lost his left leg to a Soviet shell at Stalingrad, Marcks had earned a reputation as one of the Wehrmacht's most meticulous strategic planners. His colleagues called him Der Prophet behind his back, though never with affection. The photographs spread before him showed something that made his blood run cold. Aerial reconnaissance images of southern England's coastal towns, taken by high-altitude Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over the previous 6 weeks. Town after town showed the same pattern: American and British military vehicles packed into every available space, landing craft crowding harbour after harbour, troops conducting training exercises on beaches that bore suspicious resemblance to the Normandy coastline. Marcks pulled out a worn notebook and began calculating. If British ports could accommodate roughly 300 vessels of various sizes, and the Americans were expanding facilities along England's southern coast to handle perhaps 200 more, and if one factored in the smaller craft that could be assembled in auxiliary harbours. His pencil scratched across the paper, working through logistics that would have made a peacetime quartermaster weep. The numbers that emerged seemed impossible. Somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 ships would be required to move the force that appeared to be assembling across the Channel. He lit a cigarette with hands that had started to tremble. 8,000 ships. The entire Kriegsmarine Germany's navy possessed fewer than 400 operational vessels. The Luftwaffe had perhaps 300 aircraft available for defensive operations in France. What Marcks was looking at wasn't a military operation. It was an extinction event. That night, Marcks drafted a 30-page report titled Defensive Considerations for Channel Coast Operations. The document made its way through military channels with the speed of cold honey. It passed across the desk of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the elderly commander of German forces in the West, who added a perfunctory endorsement and forwarded it to Berlin. There it languished in the offices of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the Wehrmacht High Command, until it finally reached Adolf Hitler's Chief of Staff, Wilhelm Keitel. Keitel, a man whose primary qualification was absolute loyalty to the Führer rather than military competence, read exactly 3 pages before scrawling unrealistic pessimism across the cover and filing it away. The report joined hundreds of others in a safe where uncomfortable truths went to die, but Marcks couldn't let it die. Through the summer and fall of 1943, he continued refining his estimates, incorporating every scrap of intelligence that filtered through German reconnaissance. He wasn't the only one seeing the signs. In Normandy itself, a network of coastal defense commanders were filing their own reports, each one painting the same picture of inadequate preparation facing an overwhelming threat. Generalleutnant Richter commanded the 716th Infantry Division, responsible for defending a 34-kilometre stretch of coastline that would later be known as Sword and Juno beaches. Richter's division was considered a static division, a polite military term for units composed largely of soldiers deemed unfit for frontline Eastern Front service. His ranks included men over 40, recovering wounded, and conscripts from occupied territories whose loyalty was questionable at best. They were equipped with captured French and Soviet weapons for which ammunition was scarce. In November 1943, Richter conducted a readiness inspection that left him unable to sleep for 3 nights. His division possessed 42 artillery pieces, most dating from World War I, 11 operational tanks, 6 of which were obsolete French models captured in 1940. No air support beyond vague promises from a Luftwaffe that was hemorrhaging aircraft over Germany proper coastal fortifications that looked impressive to visiting dignitaries, but would crumble under sustained naval bombardment, Richter wrote in his private diary. We are expected to stop the invasion of Europe with weapons our grandfathers would have considered outdated. I have begun to think of my men not as soldiers but as sacrifices, offerings to delay the inevitable by hours, perhaps days if we are lucky. Further west, defending what the Allies would call Omaha Beach, Generalmajor Erich Kraiss commanded the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit actually considered combat effective by Wehrmacht standards. Kraiss, 51 years old and a veteran of France, Yugoslavia, and Russia, was under no illusions about his strategic situation. His division occupied strong defensive positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach, positions that would indeed prove devastatingly effective against the initial American assault waves. But Kraiss understood mathematics better than most of his fellow commanders. In January 1944, he submitted a resource request that his superiors later characterized as bordering on insubordination. Kraiss requested 400 additional artillery pieces, 12,000 more troops, 50 kilometers of additional beach obstacles, air support squadrons dedicated exclusively to coastal defense, authority to requisition civilian labor for fortification construction. He received 8 artillery pieces, delivered in March 1,200 replacement troops, mostly teenagers from the 1,926 birth cohort with 6 weeks of training. Permission to continue fortification efforts as resources allow, a commendation for his exemplary devotion to duty, Kraiss responded to. The commendation with a letter that never made it past his immediate superior. The letter, discovered in archives after the war, read in part, I am tasked with stopping the ocean with a sieve. The commendation would be better spent as scrap paper for kindling. At least then it might warm my men through one more night before we are swept away. As winter gave way to spring in 1944, the Germans defending the Normandy coast found themselves caught in a peculiar form of psychological torture. They knew the invasion was coming. The only questions were where and when. Intelligence reports, refugee accounts, and simple logic all pointed to an assault somewhere along the Channel coast. Yet the High Command seemed paralyzed by conflicting priorities and Hitler's increasingly erratic strategic directives. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived to take command of Army Group B in November 1943, tasked with improving the Atlantic Wall defenses. Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, brought energy and organizational genius to the task. He ordered millions of beach obstacles, constructed wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, Belgian gates, all designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. He expanded minefields, strengthened bunkers, and drilled his troops relentlessly. But even Rommel couldn't conjure resources from thin air. By May 1944, he had managed to install roughly 4 million mines along the Atlantic coast, far short of his goal of 50 million. The beach obstacles covered perhaps 30% of likely landing zones. And most critically, he had no answer to the question that kept every German coastal commander awake at night. What happens when they achieve air and naval superiority so complete that our fortifications simply cease to exist? Marks, promoted to command of the 84th Corps in Normandy, continued his role as unwelcome prophet. In May 1944, just weeks before the invasion, he presented updated intelligence estimates at a Corps commanders' meeting. The projections now suggested 6,000 to 7,000 ships, supported by complete Allied air supremacy. The Luftwaffe had been so thoroughly beaten over Germany that it could spare perhaps 100 aircraft for French coastal defence, and those would be flying against an Allied air force numbering in the thousands. One of the commanders present, whose name is lost to history, reportedly interrupted Marks to ask, "So, what you're telling us is that we're already dead. We simply haven't been informed of it yet." Marks, ever the meticulous analyst, responded, "No, Herr General. What I'm telling you is that the men under our command are already dead. We, as their commanders, will likely survive long enough to be captured. That is the merciful arithmetic of overwhelming force it kills from the bottom of the command structure upward." The meeting adjourned in silence. The final weeks before D-Day took on a surreal quality for German coastal defenders. They could see it coming. The build-up across the Channel was so massive that even the most optimistic intelligence analyst couldn't deny it. Yet they remained chained to defensive positions they knew to be inadequate, armed with weapons they knew to be insufficient, awaiting support they knew would never arrive. Oberst Walter Korfes, commanding a regiment within the 352nd Division, spent his evenings writing letters to his wife in Bavaria. The letters, preserved in family archives, offer a window into the psychology of men awaiting their own destruction. On May 28, 1944, he wrote, "My dearest Anna, I have stood on these cliffs and watched British reconnaissance aircraft circle like vultures over carrion. They photograph our positions so thoroughly that they likely have better maps than we possess. We fire at them with anti-aircraft guns built in 1917, achieving nothing except revealing our positions for tomorrow's photography. It is the most exquisite torture imaginable to see your death approaching with absolute certainty, yet to be required to stand and wait for it with military discipline." The weather in early June turned stormy, and for a few days, German commanders allowed themselves to hope that the invasion might be delayed, perhaps even until 1945, when Germany's promised miracle weapons, the V-rockets and jet aircraft, might materialize in sufficient numbers to change the strategic equation. Some coastal commanders even permitted themselves to imagine a winter invasion, where German defenders might fight from prepared positions against attackers struggling through cold seas and hostile weather. On the night of June 5, 1944, Allied airborne troops began landing behind German lines in Normandy. The reports filtering into German command posts were confused and contradictory paratroopers dropping across a wide area, some landing directly on German positions, others scattered across the French countryside. Some commanders thought it might be a diversionary raid. Others suspected the prelude to the main invasion. Marks was celebrating his 53rd birthday at his headquarters in Saint-Lô when the first reports arrived. He cut short his modest celebration, a few fellow officers, some wine, a cake that tasted more of sawdust than flour given Germany's increasingly dire supply situation. By midnight, he was reviewing situation reports and concluding that this was it. The long-anticipated invasion was beginning. He gave orders for his units to move to defensive positions, and then did something remarkable. He sat down and wrote a final entry in his personal journal, a document that would be recovered by American forces after his death later that summer. The entry read, "The catastrophe begins. I have spent 14 months trying to prevent this day, then preparing for it, and finally accepting its inevitability. In a few hours, I will watch the horizon light up with more naval guns than exist in the entire Kriegsmarine. I will see the sky darken with more aircraft than Germany has possessed in the entire war, and I will give orders that I know cannot be obeyed, to men who will die following them regardless. This is the mathematics of total war. Sometimes the equation resolves to zero, no matter how the variables are arranged. We are about to become zero." As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, Erich Marcks made his way to an observation post on the cliffs overlooking what the Allies designated as Omaha Beach. He brought with him a pair of naval binoculars, a map case, and a flask of schnapps he'd been saving for either a victory celebration or a wake. He suspected it would be the latter. What he saw as the sun rose higher and the morning mist began to lift would remain burned into his memory for the 5 weeks he had left to live. The English Channel, as far as the eye could see, was covered in ships, not dozens of ships, not hundreds of ships, thousands of ships, arranged in massive convoys that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Battleships whose guns could hurl 1-ton shells 20 miles inland. Cruisers, destroyers, and vessels he couldn't even identify from this distance. And landing craft, hundreds upon hundreds of landing craft, each packed with troops and equipment, organized into assault waves with a precision that spoke to months of planning and rehearsal. Marks raised his binoculars and began a count, more from professional habit than any military necessity. After reaching 400 vessels in one small section of his field of view, he gave up. The mathematics he'd been performing for 14 months had finally been made flesh. His estimates of 6,000 to 7,000 ships had been, if anything, conservative. He uncapped his flask and took a long drink. Then he reached for the field telephone to report to his superior headquarters. The conversation was brief. "Sir, the invasion has begun. Naval forces are." Marks paused, searching for words adequate to what he was witnessing. "There are no naval forces. There is only the ocean, and the ocean has been transformed into ships. We cannot count them. We can only wait for them." The voice on the other end of the line asked about Allied air activity. Marks looked up. The sky was beginning to fill with aircraft, wave after wave after wave, flying at altitudes that put them beyond the reach of German anti-aircraft fire. He could identify B-17 bombers, medium bombers, fighter bombers, and dozens of other aircraft types. "The Luftwaffe?" the voice asked. "There is no Luftwaffe here," Marks replied. "There is only their Luftwaffe. We might as well be reporting on the weather. One does not fight the weather. One endures it, or one dies." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The naval bombardment began at 0550 hours, and within minutes, the carefully constructed German defensive positions that had taken months to build started disappearing into clouds of pulverized concrete and earth. Oberst Walter Kraiss, commanding his regiment from a reinforced bunker 3 kilometers inland from Omaha Beach, experienced the bombardment as a physical assault on consciousness itself. The bunker concrete walls 2 meters thick, steel-reinforced ceiling, designed to withstand anything short of a direct hit from the heaviest bombs, shook like a child's toy in the hands of an angry god. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The single electric bulb swung wildly on its cord, casting manic shadows across maps that were already becoming obsolete. Each salvo from the Allied battleships arrived with a sound that defied description. It wasn't merely loud, it was a physical presence that compressed the air in the bunker, made breathing difficult, and caused the human body to vibrate at frequencies that induced nausea and disorientation. Kraiss had survived artillery barrages on the Eastern Front, had endured Soviet Katyusha rocket attacks that turned entire grid squares into moonscapes. This was different. This was industrialized destruction on a scale that rewrote the rules of warfare. A young lieutenant, barely 20 years old, vomited in the corner of the bunker. No one reprimanded him. 2 other officers sat with their hands pressed over their ears, eyes squeezed shut, lips moving in silent prayer. Kraiss himself gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white, not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from the sheer effort of maintaining enough composure to function as a commander. The sound pattern itself told a story of coordinated devastation. First came the distant rumble of the guns, firing a sound that rolled across the water like thunder. Then came the shrieking descent of the shells, a banshee wail that grew louder and more insistent until it seemed to fill the entire world. Finally came the impact, not a single explosion, but a rolling barrage that moved systematically across the defensive zone, destroying everything in a predetermined pattern. This wasn't random bombardment. This was surgical destruction, executed by ships whose fire, control systems could place shells within meters of designated targets from ranges exceeding 20 kilometers. The telephone lines to forward positions went dead within the first 15 minutes. One by one, the field phones rang their distinctive mechanical bells one final time, then fell silent. Kraiss imagined what was happening at the other end of those severed connections. Bunkers collapsing, trenches caving in, men being buried alive or simply vaporized by shells that weighed more than a small automobile. Hauptmann Friedrich Ziegelmann, the operations officer for the 352nd Division, had positioned himself in a forward observation post to maintain visual contact with the beach defences. His position, a reinforced concrete structure built into the cliffs, gave him an unobstructed view of the shoreline and the English Channel beyond. What he witnessed in the first hour of bombardment would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Allied naval formation was arrayed in precise geometric patterns, each ship in its designated fire zone, each gun crew executing fire missions with mechanical efficiency. Battleships formed the outer ring, their massive guns reaching deep inland. Cruisers occupied the middle distances, suppressing coastal batteries. Destroyers prowled closer to shore, engaging specific targets with rapid fire. And behind them all, stretching to the horizon, came the landing craft wave after wave after wave, each formation timed to arrive as the bombardment lifted from its designated beach sector. Ziegelmann attempted to maintain a count of the ships, scribbling notes on a pad that quickly became illegible from the shaking of his hands. He counted 23 battleships and heavy cruisers in his limited field of view, 47 destroyers and light cruisers. Over 200 landing craft in the first assault wave alone, with more forming up behind them. And these were only the vessels he could see from his single vantage point, covering perhaps 1/5 of the total invasion frontage. He tried to calculate fire rates. A battleship's main guns could fire perhaps 2 rounds per minute per barrel. If each battleship averaged 9 main guns, and many had more, that meant each ship was throwing approximately 18 tons of explosives per minute at German positions. Multiply that by 23 visible battleships, and the mathematics became obscene. Over 400 tons of high explosives per minute, just from the heavy ships, just in this one sector. Mein Gott, Ziegelmann whispered to no one in particular. They're not trying to suppress our defences. They're trying to delete them from existence. A nearby explosion, close enough to shower the observation post with debris, punctuated his observation. Through the smoke and dust, he could see what remained of Strong Point 62, one of the most heavily fortified positions on Omaha Beach. The position had mounted 4 75mm guns in reinforced casemates, surrounded by machine gun nests, barbed wire, and minefields. Ziegelmann had inspected it personally 2 weeks earlier and deemed it virtually impregnable. Now it was a smoking crater. The casemates had been penetrated by shells designed specifically to defeat reinforced concrete. The guns lay twisted and half buried. The defenders, if any had survived, were entombed beneath tons of rubble. Strong Point 62 had been removed from the battlefield as thoroughly as if it had never existed, and the bombardment was systematically repeating this erasure across the entire defensive zone. When the naval bombardment finally lifted after nearly an hour, Kraiss emerged from the bunker expecting to see a transformed landscape. He wasn't disappointed, though disappointed was hardly the word for what he felt. The carefully prepared defensive line trenches, machine gun nests, artillery positions, obstacles had been systematically erased. Where there had been fortifications, there were now craters. Where there had been minefields, there were now churned. Wastelands where the mines had been detonated en masse, or buried so deep they'd become irrelevant. But perhaps most disturbing was what the bombardment had done to the terrain itself. The Normandy coastline, with its natural ridges and depressions that German planners had incorporated into their defensive scheme, had been literally reshaped. Hills were lower, depressions were filled with debris. The sight lines that German gunners had carefully calculated and recorded were now meaningless, because the landscape they'd been calculated for no longer existed. A sergeant emerged from a collapsed trench, his face grey with dust and shock. "Sir," he reported in a voice that trembled despite his obvious efforts to control it. "3rd Company's positions, they're gone. Not overrun, not damaged, gone. There's nothing there anymore, just holes in the ground." But the bombardment had only been the beginning. Now came the air assault. Generalleutnant Richter, commanding the 716th Division defending Sword and Juno beaches, watched from his command post as wave after wave of Allied aircraft swept over the coastline. He'd requested fighter support from the Luftwaffe 3 hours earlier. The response had been a terse message. No aircraft available. Maintain current defensive posture. No aircraft available. Richter wanted to laugh, but found he'd forgotten how. Above him, the sky contained hundreds of aircraft. Bombers flying in precise formations, their bomb bays opening with mechanical precision to release payloads that fell in saturation patterns across German positions. Fighter bombers diving at angles that seemed impossibly steep, releasing rockets that left trails of white smoke before obliterating their targets. Reconnaissance aircraft circling at high altitude, coordinating the destruction below with radio calls that German interceptors could hear but not interfere with. The Allies hadn't achieved air superiority that term suggested there was still a contest. This was air dominance so complete that German soldiers were learning to identify different Allied aircraft types the way birdwatchers catalogued species. Not for tactical advantage, but simply because there was nothing else to do except watch and wait. Richter's intelligence officer, a captain named Ernst Düring, had been keeping a tally on a chalkboard in the command post. By 0800 hours, he'd counted over 800 Allied aircraft visible at any given moment. The number climbed steadily. By 0900, it exceeded 1,200. By 1,000 hours, Düring stopped counting and simply wrote "total" on the chalkboard in large letters. "What does total mean?" Richter asked, though he already knew the answer. "Total air superiority, sir. Total air dominance. Total air. Everything." Düring's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man reciting an autopsy report. "They own the sky the way we own the ground beneath our feet. Actually," he corrected himself with a bitter laugh, "they own that too. They can reach out from 30 kilometers away and turn any square meter of French soil into a grave whenever they choose. We just happen to be standing on it for the moment." Düring had been an analyst before the war, working for an insurance company in Hamburg, calculating actuarial tables and risk assessments. His methodical mind had translated well to military intelligence work, and he'd earned a reputation for accurate estimates based on fragmentary information. Now he turned that analytical precision on their current situation. "Sir, may I present some calculations?" He didn't wait for permission. The Allies are flying approximately 1,500 sorties per hour across the invasion zone. Each fighter bomber carries an average payload of 500 kilograms. Each medium bomber carries approximately 2,000 kilograms. Each heavy bomber carries 4,000 to 6,000 kilograms. If we assume a conservative mixture of aircraft types and a conservative estimate of 1,200 sorties per hour discounting reconnaissance and fighter escort, they are delivering approximately 1,000 tons of ordnance per hour from the air alone. He paused to let the numbers sink in. Combined with naval gunfire, the Allies are directing roughly 1,500 tons of high explosives per hour at our defensive positions. Our entire division's artillery complement, firing at maximum rate, which is physically impossible to sustain, could deliver perhaps 20 tons per hour. They are applying 75 times our maximum theoretical firepower, and they can sustain this indefinitely, because their supply lines stretch back to factories in America that we cannot touch. Richter stared at the chalkboard, at the word "total" written in Düring's precise handwriting. "How long can we hold?" he asked quietly. Düring considered the question with the same analytical precision he'd applied to everything else. "That depends on how we define hold, sir. Can we prevent them from coming ashore?" "No, that's already happening." "Can we contain the beachhead?" "They have sufficient force to expand wherever they choose." "Can we make them pay a price for every meter?" "Yes, for a time. But the real question is, at what point does continuing to resist become indistinguishable from organized suicide?" The landing craft hit the beaches at different times across the 5 invasion zones: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. German commanders, isolated in their respective command posts with fragmentary communications and contradictory reports, struggled to piece together a coherent picture of what was happening. But certain facts became undeniable quickly. At Utah Beach, the Americans came ashore with overwhelming force and relatively light opposition. The preliminary bombardment had been so effective that many German defensive positions simply ceased to exist. The few that remained intact found themselves engaged by naval gunfire so accurate it seemed personal, as if each bunker had been assigned its own battleship, and that battleship had taken the assignment personally. Major Werner Pluskat, an artillery commander responsible for a section of defensive batteries near Utah Beach, experienced this personalized destruction firsthand. His battery consisted of 4 105mm guns, positioned in concrete emplacements that had taken 3 months to construct. The positions were camouflaged, dispersed across nearly a kilometer of coastline, and protected by overhead cover, designed to withstand anything except a direct hit. At 0622 hours, an Allied spotter aircraft circled overhead, well beyond the range of his anti-aircraft guns. Pluskat watched it through binoculars, a sense of dread building in his chest. The aircraft circled 3 times, then departed. 4 minutes later, the first salvo arrived 8 rounds from a cruiser stationed nearly 15 kilometers offshore. The first rounds were ranging shots, bracketing his positions. The second salvo was direct hits. Pluskat watched as gun position 3 simply disappeared. One moment there was a concrete emplacement with a gun crew preparing to fire. The next moment there was a crater 12 meters across and 4 meters deep. The gun itself had been blown completely out of the emplacement and lay twisted beyond recognition 30 meters away. The crew of 7 men had vanished, not killed in the conventional sense, but atomized by the combination of blast pressure and explosive fragmentation. Gun position 2 lasted slightly longer. The first shell struck the overhead cover, penetrating the concrete and detonating inside the emplacement. Pluskat saw smoke and flame erupt from the gun port, followed by secondary explosions as stored ammunition cooked off. The position was still technically there, but it would never fire again. Pluskat ordered the surviving crews to abandon their positions and take cover. As he ran for a bunker, he glanced back and saw another salvo arrive, systematically destroying gun positions 1 and 4. The entire battery, 3 months of construction, 4 irreplaceable guns, 35 trained men had been eliminated in less than 10 minutes by a ship that Pluskat couldn't even see without binoculars. Generalmajor Erich Marcks, coordinating the defense from his Corps headquarters, received a report from the Utah sector at 0745 hours. Enemy forces ashore in battalion strength. Defensive fires ineffective due to targeting by naval guns. Request immediate reinforcement. By 0815, the report had evolved. Enemy forces ashore in regimental strength. All forward positions destroyed or abandoned. Request immediate reinforcement. By 0845, enemy forces expanding beachhead. Multiple divisions ashore. No reinforcement received. Request. The transmission ended abruptly. Marks stared at the map, moving coloured pins that represented units he knew were already destroyed, deleted, erased from the order of battle. The theatre of it seemed important, somehow maintaining the fiction of command and control, even as the reality disintegrated. He'd been a general staff officer long enough to understand that much of military leadership was elaborate performance art, designed to create the illusion of mastery over chaos. But there came a point where the chaos was simply too overwhelming for the illusion to hold. At Omaha Beach, where Kraiss's 352nd Division held the high ground, the battle evolved differently. The Americans encountered fierce resistance, and for a few hours that morning, the landing teetered on the edge of disaster. Bodies piled up at the water's edge, landing craft burned. Officers were killed before they could organize their men. The natural amphitheater of the beach, overlooked by bluffs honeycombed with German positions, turned into a killing ground. Kraiss, watching from an observation post, allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. His men were fighting magnificently, destroying landing craft, pinning down infantry, exacting a terrible toll. Machine gun, Teams in their fortified positions were firing down on the beach with devastating effect. Artillery observers were calling in accurate fire. The American advance had stalled completely in several sectors, with soldiers pinned behind beach obstacles and unable to move forward or back. Perhaps the invasion could be stopped after all. Perhaps his months of preparation and his stubborn insistence on proper fortification would prove justified. Perhaps the Allies had finally encountered a defensive position so strong that even their overwhelming material advantage couldn't overcome it. Then the Allied command did something that no German wargame, no defensive plan, no strategic consideration had adequately prepared for. They simply escalated. Destroyers fast, maneuverable ships that normally stayed well offshore to avoid grounding or being hit by coastal artillery steamed directly toward the beach, into water so shallow their hulls were scraping bottom. They came so close that German troops could see individual sailors on deck, could read the ship numbers painted on their hulls. Then they opened fire at point-blank range, turning their 5-inch guns on German positions with devastating accuracy. A destroyer's 5-inch gun, firing from 800 meters at a target it can visually observe, doesn't just destroy a bunker, it obliterates the bunker, the men inside, the trench network around it, and the immediate area around it, turning everything into a crater filled with smoking debris. The shells arrived with such rapidity that German troops spoke of it later as being hit by a continuous stream of fire rather than individual shots. Lieutenant Heinz Grass commanded a strongpoint overlooking the Easy Red sector of Omaha Beach. His position included 3 machine gun nests, a 50mm anti-tank gun, and a reinforced observation bunker. From this position, his men had inflicted terrible casualties on the American forces struggling ashore. Grass had personally witnessed his gunners destroy at least 4 landing craft and pin down an entire company of American infantry. Then the USS Frankfurt, a destroyer of the Gleaves class, turned its attention to his strongpoint. The first ranging shot missed by perhaps 10 meters, close enough that the concussion knocked Grass off his feet. He scrambled back to the observation slit in time to see the destroyer's guns train directly on his position. The second shot hit the anti-tank gun emplacement, killing the crew instantly and sending the gun tumbling down the slope toward the beach. The third and fourth shots hit the machine gun nests. The fifth shot penetrated the observation bunker's firing slit, a shot that required either incredible skill or impossible luck, and detonated inside. Grass regained consciousness minutes later, buried under debris, both eardrums ruptured, bleeding from his nose and mouth. Of his platoon of 36 men, he would later learn that only 8 survived, and most of those were too wounded or shell-shocked to continue fighting. The strongpoint that had held up an entire American company had been neutralized in less than 3 minutes by a single ship firing at suicidally close range. Kraiss watched as position after position simply disappeared under this point-blank naval gunfire. His carefully constructed defense, his months of work, his beautifully prepared killing ground, all of it erased by ships that were willing to risk grounding themselves to complete their mission. The Americans were taking a calculated risk, trading the possible loss of a few destroyers to ensure the landing succeeded. It was the kind of calculation that only a force with overwhelming material advantage could afford to make. By 1100 hours, American troops were off Omaha Beach and moving inland. The cost had been terrible: over 2,000 American casualties on that beach alone, more than on all the other beaches combined. But they were moving, and nothing Kraiss could do would stop them now. He'd fought brilliantly with inadequate resources against overwhelming force, and he'd lost. The mathematics allowed no other outcome. Further east, at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, British and Canadian forces came ashore with a professionalism that spoke to years of training and careful planning. They brought specialized armor tanks equipped with flails to clear mines, tanks that could lay bridges over obstacles, tanks that could destroy bunkers with devastating flame weapons called crocodiles. Each of these specialized vehicles addressed a specific defensive problem, and the Allies had brought enough of them to solve every problem simultaneously. Richter, watching his defensive line collapse sector by sector, realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in military history: the complete systemization of amphibious assault. The Allies hadn't just planned this invasion, they'd engineered it, the way one might engineer a massive construction project. Every obstacle anticipated, every problem solved in advance, every contingency planned for. A report arrived from one of his battalion commanders, Major Klaus Biebig. Enemy armor includes vehicles we cannot identify. One type appears designed specifically to destroy barbed wire. Another lays trackway over soft sand. A third shoots some kind of projectile that demolishes concrete. They have specialized vehicles for clearing mines, for crossing anti-tank ditches, for bridging obstacles. They have an answer for everything. It's as if they've been planning this for years. They have been planning this for years, Richter said quietly. We've been reacting for months. That's the difference between a systematic solution and an improvised response. One of Richter's company commanders, Hauptmann Walter Hennig, called in with a report that captured the hopelessness of the German position. Sir, we are engaging enemy armor with our anti-tank guns. We score hits. We see our rounds strike their tanks, but they keep coming. Their armor is too thick for our weapons to penetrate at any except point-blank range, and if we let them get that close, they simply fire directly into our positions. And when we do manage to knock out a tank, 2 more appear to take its place. We are not fighting a battle, we are fighting a production line. By noon on June 6th, the true scale of German miscalculation was becoming apparent to every commander in Normandy. This wasn't a raid that might be repulsed. This wasn't an exploratory landing that might be contained. This was the Allies taking France back, and they'd brought such overwhelming force that German resistance, however brave or skillful, could only delay the inevitable. Marks received a telephone call from Field Marshal Rommel's headquarters at 1300 hours. Rommel himself was in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, a fact that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His chief of staff, Generalmajor Hans Speidel, wanted an assessment of the situation. The situation, Marks said slowly, choosing his words carefully, is that the Allies have achieved complete naval and air dominance. They possess approximately 7,000 vessels of all types. They possess air superiority numbering in the thousands of aircraft. They have landed at least 5 divisions, possibly more, across multiple beaches. Our defensive positions have been systematically destroyed by a weight of firepower that exceeds anything in our experience. Our counterattacks are being destroyed from the air before they can reach their objectives. Our reinforcements are pinned down by air attacks during daylight hours and can only move at night, which means they arrive in pieces rather than as coherent units. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. And your recommendation, General Marks? My recommendation is that we accept that the invasion has succeeded. Not might succeed. Has succeeded. The only question now is how many of our men die pretending otherwise. We need to establish defensive positions inland, away from naval gunfire range, and conduct a fighting withdrawal that preserves our forces for battles we might actually have some chance of winning. The beachhead cannot be eliminated. It can only expand. Every hour we pretend otherwise is an hour spent destroying units that cannot be replaced. General Marks. Speidel's voice took on a harder edge. Such defeatism is not defeatism, Herr General. Mathematics. They have 7,000 ships. We have reports of ships. They have air dominance. We have air aspirations. They have sufficient force to sustain losses that would cripple us and still continue operations. We have sufficient force to delay them by hours or days at the cost of units that cannot be replaced. These are facts, not opinions. I would respectfully suggest that whoever is writing the orders at higher headquarters take a look at the actual situation reports rather than the situation they wish existed. The Chief of Staff informed Marks that reinforcements were being dispatched, including panzer divisions held in reserve, specifically the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and the Panzer Lehr Division. Marks thanked him and hung up the phone. Then he turned to his own staff and said something that would be repeated by German commanders across Normandy in the hours and days to come. The reinforcements will arrive too late, in insufficient strength, against an enemy that can destroy them from the air long before they reach the battlefield. The 12th SS consists largely of fanatical teenagers who've never faced combat. They'll be brave, and they'll die bravely, but bravery doesn't defeat fighter bombers. The Panzer is a superb formation, but it will have to travel over 150 kilometers to reach the front, and every kilometer will be under Allied air attack. We are not fighting a battle, we are participating in a demonstration of industrial capacity. The Allies are showing us what it means to possess total material superiority. I suspect we are being taught a lesson, though I'm not sure we'll live long enough to fully comprehend it. As afternoon wore on into evening, the scope of the disaster continued to expand. German counterattacks launched bravely by units that had no idea what they were marching into were spotted by aerial reconnaissance, reported to naval and air commanders, and destroyed long before they could reach Allied positions. The process had become systematized. Reconnaissance aircraft would spot German movement, call in the coordinates, and within minutes, fighter bombers or naval gunfire would arrive to destroy the target. Panzer units, the pride of the Wehrmacht, found themselves being hunted by squadrons of rocket-firing Typhoon fighter bombers that could destroy a tank with a single strike. The Typhoons carried 8 60-pound rockets each, and they hunted in pairs or fours. A German tank column that attempted to move during daylight might face attacks from dozens of aircraft, each making multiple passes. The wreckage along the roads leading toward Normandy told a story of one-sided destruction. Oberst Kraiss, attempting to organize a counterattack with his remaining forces, watched in horror as a column of his own trucks and half-tracks was caught in the open by Allied aircraft. He'd ordered the movement to take place just before dusk, hoping that gathering darkness would provide some protection. But the Allies had anticipated even this, and the column was caught in perfect light for the attack. The strike came from a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers operating from bases in England. The aircraft arrived at treetop level, giving almost no warning. The attack lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, the column was a line of burning wrecks stretching for half a kilometer. Trucks were overturned, half-tracks were burning fiercely, ammunition was cooking off in secondary explosions that continued for nearly an hour. The survivors there were fewer than 20 from a convoy that had carried over 200 men staggered into his command post in a state of shock that transcended anything Kraiss had seen in Russia. One sergeant, a veteran of 2 years on the Eastern Front, simply sat down and stared at nothing, unable or unwilling to speak. Another, his uniform still smoking, kept repeating, "They came from nowhere. They came from nowhere." A third survivor, a young corporal named Stefan Heinz, managed to give a coherent report. "They came from the west, flying so low I could see the pilots' faces. We heard them, then they were on us. Rockets, bombs, machine guns, everything happened at once. The first pass destroyed the lead vehicles and blocked the road. The second pass destroyed the rear vehicles and trapped us. Then they just worked their way down the column. Methodically, like farmers harvesting wheat. Then they were gone. The whole thing." He struggled for words. It was like being struck by lightning, if lightning were calculated and precise and specifically intended to kill you. Kraiss filed the report mechanically, adding it to the growing pile of after-action reports that all told the same story. Allied air power was making daytime movement impossible, and nighttime movement merely dangerous rather than suicidal. Any concentration of German forces large enough to pose a threat was large enough to be spotted from the air and destroyed before it could accomplish anything. That night, as Allied forces consolidated their beachheads and prepared to expand inland, German commanders across Normandy took stock of their situation. The reports, compiled by staff officers in bunkers and cellars across the invasion zone, made grim reading. Estimated 156,000 Allied troops ashore, with more arriving every hour, complete Allied naval superiority. No German naval forces able to contest the landing, complete Allied air superiority, fewer than 100 Luftwaffe. Sorties flown, compared to over 14,000 Allied sorties, all forward defensive positions destroyed, bypassed, or cut off from supply. Communications networks shattered, with most telephone lines destroyed and radio communications being jammed or intercepted, reinforcement columns unable to move during daylight due to air attacks, no prospect of the situation improving. Generalmajor Marks sat in his command, a post that evening, surrounded by maps that were already obsolete and situation reports that painted a picture of comprehensive defeat. The electric lights had failed hours earlier. Allied bombers had made a systematic effort to destroy power infrastructure, so he worked by the light of kerosene lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing letters he knew would probably never be delivered. One, addressed to his wife, read, "My dearest Elizabeth, today I witnessed the end of German military power in the West. It did not end in a climactic battle or a decisive moment of defeat. It ended in the simple, overwhelming application of industrial capacity. The Allies brought 7,000 ships because they could build 7,000 ships. They brought total air dominance because their factories produce aircraft the way ours produce excuses. They brought so much of everything that our preparations, which seemed adequate in the abstract, proved utterly meaningless in practice. I have spent my career studying warfare, and I believed I understood it. I studied the great campaigns, the decisive battles, the moments where superior generalship or troop quality or tactical brilliance carried the day. But today taught me that modern warfare is not about tactics or bravery or even generalship. It is about production capacity, logistics, and the ability to bring overwhelming force to bear. The Allies possessed all three. We possessed soldiers who fought bravely and died pointlessly because no amount of bravery can defeat 7,000 ships. The young men dying in the ditches tonight were not defeated by superior Allied soldiers, though the Allied soldiers are certainly competent. They were defeated by American factories that we cannot bomb, British shipyards that we cannot reach, and Canadian industries that exist beyond our sphere of influence. They were defeated in Detroit and Birmingham and Montreal, months before they ever saw a landing craft approaching the beach. If I do not return, please know that I died understanding exactly why. That is more than most men receive. Kiss the children for me. Tell them their father served honorably in an impossible situation. And tell them to remember that in war, courage and skill matter, but production capacity matters more. Your loving husband, Erich." He sealed the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, next to a small photograph of his family taken before the war, when such things as family photographs and peaceful summers had seemed permanent rather than precious. American soldiers would find both the letter and the photograph 6 weeks later, after Marks was killed by Allied fighter bombers while trying to reach the front lines. In the bunkers and command posts across Normandy, other German officers were reaching similar conclusions. The invasion had succeeded not because of Allied tactical brilliance, though that had certainly been present, and not because of German tactical failures, though those had occurred as well. It had succeeded because the Allies had achieved such total naval and air dominance that German defensive preparations became irrelevant. You cannot fortify against an enemy who can stand off at a safe distance and systematically destroy everything you've built. You cannot counterattack when your columns are visible from the air and vulnerable to destruction before they reach their objectives. You cannot defend when the enemy possesses such overwhelming material superiority that your best efforts merely delay, rather than defeat their advance. Kraiss, exhausted and shell-shocked, sat with his staff officers in a cellar that still smelled of the French family who'd abandoned it days earlier, the faint scent of cooking and wood smoke, and the particular mustiness of a home that had been lived in for generations. Someone had left behind a bottle of cognac, probably hidden from German requisition teams, and they passed it around in silence. The bottle bore a label indicating it had been laid down in 1928, a year when none of them had imagined they'd be sitting in a French cellar drinking it while contemplating their own obsolescence as military commanders. 7,000 ships, someone said, finally, breaking the silence that had stretched for nearly 10 minutes. 7,000 ships, another repeated, as if the repetition might make the number more comprehensible. Kraiss took the bottle and drank deeply, feeling the burn of the cognac but tasting nothing. His mind was elsewhere, running through the day's events, trying to find the decision point where things might have gone differently. But there was no such point. The outcome had been determined by factors far beyond his control, determined months or years earlier when the Allies had committed to building an invasion force so overwhelming that no defense could stop it. "I want you all to remember this day," Kraiss said suddenly, his voice cutting through the depression that had settled over the room like fog. "Remember what it feels like to face an enemy with such absolute material superiority that your courage, your training, your preparation, none of it matters. Remember it, because this is what we've done to others. This is what we brought to Poland, to France, to Russia in 1941. We struck first, struck hard, with forces our enemies couldn't match. We thought ourselves invincible because we won quickly against enemies who weren't prepared." He set the bottle down carefully on a wooden crate that served as their makeshift table. "Now we know what it's like to be on the receiving end. The British didn't quit when we bombed London. The Russians didn't quit when we reached the gates of Moscow. And now we know why. Because sometimes, when the situation is hopeless, you fight anyway, not because you think you can win, but because the alternative is admitting you've already lost. And because your men are still fighting, still dying, and they deserve commanders who'll stand with them until the end, however futile that end might be." The officers sat in silence, considering this. Finally, Hauptmann Ziegelmann spoke. "So we continue fighting, even though we know we cannot win?" Kraiss confirmed, "Because that's what soldiers do. But we fight intelligently. We preserve our forces where possible. We trade space for time. We make them pay for every kilometre, but we don't throw away lives defending positions that cannot be held. And we remember that losing a battle, even losing a war, doesn't mean that the men who fought were cowards or fools. Sometimes it just means the other side brought 7,000 ships, and we brought courage. In a fair fight, courage might have been enough. But modern war isn't fair. It's mathematics, and the mathematics are against us." In Paris, at the headquarters of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander of German forces in the West, received the reports from Normandy with a sense of inevitability that bordered on relief. He'd been arguing for months that Germany lacked the resources to defend the entirety of the Atlantic coast against a determined Allied invasion. Now events had proven him correct, though he took no satisfaction in being right. Von Rundstedt, at 68 years old, was one of the few senior German commanders with enough experience and perspective to understand what D-Day really meant. He'd fought in World War I, had commanded armies through the campaigns of World War II, and had seen enough warfare to recognize when a military situation was irretrievable. The reports from Normandy told him everything he needed to know. Germany had lost the West, and probably lost the war, though the dying would continue for months or years until that reality was accepted by those who refused to see it. He composed a telegram to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command in Berlin, choosing his words with the precision of a man who knew he was creating a historical document. Allied forces have achieved successful landing in Normandy sector with overwhelming naval and air support. Conservative estimate places invasion fleet at 7,000 vessels of all types. Air operations have exceeded 10,000 sorties, with virtually no Luftwaffe response possible due to prior attrition over Reich territory. Local reserves have been committed but prove unable to contain expansion of beachhead due to enemy material superiority that surpasses all previous estimates. Forward defensive positions have been systematically eliminated by combined naval gunfire and air bombardment. Request immediate release of strategic armoured reserves and authorization for flexible defence in depth, as current directive to hold all positions is tactically unsound given overwhelming Allied firepower advantage. The response came back within hours, drafted by Hitler himself in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Current positions to be held at all costs. No retreat authorized under any circumstances. Every metre of ground to be defended to the last man. Counter-attack to drive enemy into sea to be launched immediately with all available forces. The fate of the Reich depends upon repulsing this invasion on the beaches. Von Rundstedt read the telegram twice, then placed it carefully on his desk. He removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, feeling every one of his 68 years. He'd served the German military for nearly half a century, had commanded forces in 2 world wars, and had never disobeyed a direct order. But he was looking at an order that could not be executed, a directive that existed in pure fantasy, disconnected from the reality his commanders were reporting from Normandy. He turned to his chief of staff, Generalmajor Kraiss, and said quietly, "They want us to counterattack 7,000 ships with orders and slogans. They want us to hold positions that no longer exist. They want us to achieve victory through force of will alone, as if will were sufficient to conjure tanks and aircraft from thin air. I believe this is what the Americans call wishful thinking, though I suspect even the Americans would find this level of delusion impressive." Blumentritt, loyal and tactful, said nothing. What was there to say? They both understood that the orders from Berlin bore no relationship to the situation in Normandy, that executing those orders would result in the pointless destruction of Germany's last effective military forces in the West, and that disobeying those orders would result in their immediate relief and possible execution for defeatism. They were trapped between military reality and political fantasy, with no good options available. "We'll forward the orders to the field commanders," von Rundstedt said finally. "They'll interpret them as best they can. The good ones will read between the lines and do what's necessary to preserve their forces. The ideological fanatics will follow the orders literally and die gloriously and pointlessly. And in a few weeks or months, someone in Berlin will blame us for failing to execute an impossible directive. That's how this ends." As June 6th became June 7th, and the initial invasion day passed into history, German commanders in Normandy found themselves in an impossible position. They'd been ordered to hold at all costs, but the costs were measured in units that ceased to exist, positions that had been obliterated, and soldiers who died following orders that couldn't be executed, against an enemy that couldn't be stopped. The Allies continued to pour men and material across the beaches, with a systematic efficiency that spoke to months of planning and rehearsal. By the end of June 7th, over 326,000 troops were ashore, along with thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, and enough supplies to sustain operations for weeks. The number would exceed 500,000 within a week. Each day brought more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more guns, more everything. The Allies weren't just winning, they were demonstrating that they could win while absorbing losses that would have forced Germany to abandon the entire campaign. On Omaha Beach alone, American casualties exceeded 2,000 men. For Germany, such losses would have been catastrophic, potentially forcing a reconsideration of the entire operation. For the Allies, it was an acceptable price, tragic but manageable, because they had the resources to replace those losses and continue operations without pause. Richter, commanding the shattered remnants of his 716th Division, received orders on June 8 to restore the defensive line to its pre-invasion configuration and prepare for offensive operations to eliminate the enemy beachhead. He read the order 3 times, trying to determine if it was a joke, evidence of complete disconnection from reality at higher headquarters, or perhaps a subtle test to see if he was still mentally competent. His defensive line no longer existed in any meaningful sense. His division, once numbering over 7,000 men, had been reduced to scattered remnants, totaling perhaps 1,500 effectives, many of whom were wounded, shell-shocked, or separated from their units. The pre-invasion configuration was a fantasy, a memory, a thing that had been erased by 7,000 ships and absolute air dominance more thoroughly than if it had never existed at all. He didn't respond to the order immediately. Instead, he gathered his surviving officers. There were 11 of them, out of an original complement of over 60, and told them something that could have resulted in his execution for defeatism had anyone reported it. "We're going to fall back to positions where we might actually do some good. We're going to preserve what's left of this division so that we can fight in battles where our fighting might actually matter. And we're going to ignore any order that requires us to commit suicide in order to maintain the fiction that we're still fighting a battle we've already lost. If that constitutes disobedience, you're welcome to shoot me for it. But you'll have to get in line behind the Allied Air Force, which has been trying to kill me for 2 days now, and will probably succeed eventually. No one shot him. No one even objected. They fell back to more defensible positions 10 kilometers inland and lived to fight another day, not because they thought they could win, but because surviving felt like the only form of resistance left available to men who'd been systematically defeated by forces they couldn't hope to match. The story of D-Day, from the German perspective, is not ultimately a story of tactical errors or strategic blunders, though both were certainly present. It's the story of men who understood, with absolute clarity, that they were facing an enemy with such overwhelming superiority that defeat was mathematically certain, and who fought anyway, because that's what soldiers do. They fought knowing the outcome, knowing their preparations were inadequate, knowing that their courage and skill would prove insufficient against 7,000 ships and total air dominance. Erich Marcks spent his final weeks organizing defensive operations he knew were futile, giving orders he knew couldn't change the outcome, trying to preserve the lives of men who were probably going to die regardless of what he did. He moved constantly between command posts and frontline units, trying to maintain some coherence to a defensive line that was collapsing, under systematic Allied pressure. On July 12, 1944, while travelling to the front lines in his staff car, he was caught in an Allied airstrike. The fighter bombers, probably American P-47 seconds, though no one survived to confirm, came in low and fast, strafing the road with machine gun fire and rockets. The staff car was destroyed. Marcks, thrown from the vehicle, died in a French ditch beside a road he'd been travelling to organise defences he knew were inadequate against forces he knew he couldn't defeat. He was killed by the very air dominance he'd predicted 14 months earlier, when his reports warning of Allied superiority had been dismissed as alarmist fantasy. His death was noted in German casualty reports as killed in action, though a more accurate description might have been killed by mathematics, or killed by production capacity, or simply killed by 7,000 ships and everything they represented. His final, a report to higher headquarters, written the night before he died and found in his papers after the war, contained a single line that summarized everything he'd learned, everything he'd tried to communicate, everything that German High Command had refused to accept. We are not losing this battle because we're fighting poorly. We're not losing because our soldiers lack courage or our commanders lack skill. We're losing because they brought 7,000 ships, and we brought courage. In modern warfare, courage comes in a distant second to production capacity. This is the lesson of D-Day, though I suspect it's a lesson we'll refuse to learn until we've paid for our refusal with the lives of every man in France. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.